Good morning, everybody. Happy Tuesday. We have an amazing show for everybody today. What do we have, Krystal?
Indeed, we do. Of course, lots breaking in terms of the war in Ukraine. We'll bring you all of those details. We also have some new comments to bring you from our former president that are rather eyebrow-raising. Also, a scandal in the Missouri Senate race. Eric Greitens, you guys might know this guy. He was governor. He had to resign before because of a previous set of scandals. Now, in a sworn affidavit, his ex-wife is saying that he abused not only her, but their son. We'll bring you all those details. He is staying in right now. He is doubling down. We've got his comments. It's quite a story. Also, some new data about a sort of unfolding, we have it labeled there as generational war, intergenerational war. You've got boomers and older generations who are doing extraordinarily well coming out of COVID. And you have millennials and younger basically continually screwed. That's the story of both of these generations so far. So we'll talk to you about that. Also, the worst idea for the Oscars ever proposed by Amy Schumer. And I feel like that's really saying something because we've had some very bad ideas at the Oscars that we've seen already. We're going to talk to someone I've mentioned on the show before, Igor Kotkin. He is a Russian. He lives in Moscow. He's going to talk to us about the view on the ground there. There are reports of food stables running low and sort of panicked buying and those sorts of things. So we'll talk to him about what exactly is going on there. And by the way, quite courageous for him to speak to us.
Yeah, I before we were talking, I said, listen, he needs to know what the consequences could be.
He's well aware.
I won't say more about him exactly, but he's already got a target on his back. So I would just, let's all pray for his safety after he appears.
Yeah, I mean, this is someone who he's proudly anti-war. Right. He's also openly gay, which in itself can be bold and courageous. In Russia, his boyfriend's already been arrested. Of course, we know the sort of laws that they've passed there about spreading what they call fake news. So he knows all of those risks, but still thinks it's important to talk to us and talk to our audience.
And he's welcome on the show.
Excited to speak with him. But we wanted to start with the very latest on the ground in Ukraine. Sort of escalation in terms of Russian rhetoric and continued deterioration of our relationship with them. Let's go ahead and put this first tear sheet up on the screen. This is from Reuters. They say U.S.-Moscow ties close to rupture after Biden's war criminal remarks. We'll show you those remarks in just a second. The lead of this is that Russia's foreign ministry said on Monday they had summoned our ambassador, John Sullivan, to tell him that remarks by President Joe Biden about Russian President Vladimir Putin had pushed bilateral ties to the brink of collapse. You might say that those ties were already perhaps at the brink of collapse, but this is, again, another sign of just how bad the situation is and bad the relationship is. Their comments were such statements from the American president, unworthy of a statesman of such high rank, put Russian-American relations on the verge of rupture. Those comments, specifically, Biden got asked in a kind of, as he's leaving the room, a reporter shouts out at him, do you think Putin is a war criminal? At first, he misunderstood the question, and then he comes back and says, what did you say again? And he responds the affirmative that he does think Putin is a war criminal. I'm explaining it because the audio is a little bit muffled, but let's go ahead and take a listen to that.
Did you ask me whether I was called
a war criminal, sir?
Oh, I think he is a war criminal.
Will you be meeting with us? Will you go to Poland? Will you go to Poland?
I mean, I think you would have to say at this point that is undeniably true, given the reports we've seen on the ground about civilian casualties and targeting of hospitals and of the like.
Certainly right. This may be an unpopular thing, but I don't think that the president should be so cavalier whenever we're using that type of language, whenever we're talking from an official capacity. I think you and I are commentators, and I'm very comfortable using the phrase war criminal. And here's why. We all will remember that famous clip, I think it's Susan Rice, back in 1994, twisting herself not to say the word genocide whenever it came to Rwanda. And the reason why is because those words mean something in the International Court of Law and also under U.S. treaties and obligations. So when the Biden administration is going to use that language, more what I would say is I think it's totally justified, but I think it should be given as a concerted policy speech, specifically because when you're so cavalier with that, well, now we're risking rupture with the Kremlin. Here's the other reason, which is that can you come back from being a war criminal? Like, in terms of our relations with Russia, does that not just...
Did.
Well, I guess you're right. I guess he, resurrected himself as a painter. And Dick Cheney. I'm talking more about in terms of the eyes of the world and the U.S. administration, as in, are we going to feel comfortable branding somebody a war criminal? And then in the future, let's say that Russia does come to some diplomatic solution. How will we supposed to have an off-ramp in terms of our diplomatic relations with that country? look, I understand that this all sounds uncomfortable, but this is a nuclear armed power. This is the same reason that we have relations, and I supported Trump meeting with Kim Jong-un. I think Kim Jong-un has committed acts of genocide. I think Kim Jong-un is a war criminal in very much his own right. But whenever you have nukes, that means that you are entitled to a certain level of diplomatic recognition. So it's not even that I object to what he's saying. It's that you need to be more considered in your language and not so glibly just make that pronouncement, which carries an immense weight in international politics, which has now invited the Kremlin to possibly sever ties with the United States, which is the worst thing I think could happen at this moment.
It was sort of a very Trumpian moment.
Exactly.
That it's just, off the cuff, shooting from the hip. Not really planned, not really strategic, not thoughtful, just sort of, in response in the moment, saying, whatever he thinks is appropriate without really thinking through, okay, this is our plan, this is our strategy. Those sort of words should only be used after you've really considered what the consequences will be both in the short term and the long term. I think that is important to say. And then, the other part of this, I made the joke about George W. Bush, but there is something to, U.S. hypocrisy on calling the leaders of other countries war criminals when, of course, we exempt ourselves from any sort of judgment and our leaders from any sort of judgment over the war crimes that they themselves have committed. So that's the first piece of this. The other thing that we found out yesterday, new revelations, let's go ahead and put Wall Street Journal tear sheet up on the screen, that we are sending Soviet air defense systems into Ukraine. We apparently had a secret program over, the length of the Cold War where this makes sense, we were acquiring secretly Soviet weapons so that we could study them and figure out what their capabilities are. We still have a cache of these weapons, no telling how old they are, or specifically what they are, but we learned yesterday from the Wall Street Journal that we are sending some of those systems over to Ukraine. Here's a little bit from that article. They say the systems, which one U.S. official said include the SA-8, are decades old and were obtained by the U.S. so it could examine the technology used by the Russian military and which Moscow has exported around the world. Those weapons are familiar to Ukraine's military, which inherited this type of equipment following the breakup of the Soviet Union. So in our continued quest to figure out what can we send and how can we help them and how can we bolster them, this is the very latest move that they're making.
It makes sense. This is the S-300 missile system, which is a longtime Soviet one. I actually think some NATO countries have it, like I want to say it's Bulgaria, Slovakia, and Greece in terms of their leftover from the Soviet Union. It's quite an effective and air defense system. I believe it's some things that we've seen deployed in Syria and elsewhere. So it's quite effective in its use. And obviously, whenever being used also against Russian weapons, there's generally a question too of interoperability with the Ukrainians and what they already have, which are on the ground. So look, this generally fits with the theme of the U.S. weapons that are being provided under the Biden administration with bipartisan support. Defensive weapons, as in javelins to shoot down aircraft, air defense system to stop, air defense systems as defense, and why the MiGs, those fighter jets, were seen as an offensive capability that could be used offensively by the Ukrainians, and why they would see that generally as a crossing of the line. So within that framework, I think it's okay. More what it is that I find the threat to cut ties the most troubling aspect of all of this, just because what we need more than anything is open lines of communication. And this is not a popular stance to take. Everyone's like, oh, he's standing for Putin. That's not what we're talking about here, which is that we came to the brink once of nuclear war with the Soviet Union, and those two leaders, John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev, decided that the reason why they came to the brink was their inability to talk to each other, which is why the hotline was established and between those two leaders. And one of the very first things that happened when Lyndon B. Johnson assumed the office was that they installed the hotline in his office, because it was always important in order to have that line of communication open with the Russians. And in terms of us communicating, back channeling, and more, the more open ties that we have between the two countries, even at a time when Putin is absolutely committing war crimes, then it is important, though, for the United States to balance its rhetoric and see exactly what our end game is. You did your monologue yesterday on this, and I think it's very important. What is the end game of the United States? I think it should be to support Ukraine. But if let's say that they decide decide to pursue a peace, not likely currently, given the Zelensky's comments, given Putin's comments, and all of that as well. But let's say a year from now or whatever that they decide to do. What are our quote unquote red lines? I think we should just support Ukraine and generally what they decide, which is what we're doing right now. But let's say that their position switches in the civilian population and more. Well, I think we should continue to do that.
Yeah, the question is always, how do we create the context for peace?
Right.
And you don't have to say every single thing you think about Vladimir Putin right now, because it doesn't necessarily serve the purpose of ultimately being able to have that dialogue and get to peace. And, you know, you don't accomplish anything by rhetorically calling him a war criminal. So I think those are all good points. In terms of what is happening on the ground, yesterday we brought you, you know, there's this like concerted sort of narrative effort to push out into outlets from, you know, Axios, the Washington Post, New York Times, that the war is at a stalemate. And in fact, in, you know, 2 of 3 of the fronts that Russia has been pursuing, they are sort of stymied. But they do continue to make some gains. The very latest is there's been additional shelling in Kyiv. There was a mall that was bombed in Kyiv. Of course, this is horrendous for the residents of that city who are still there and also the ones who have fled. And then let's go ahead and put this next piece up on the screen. Russians have made significant advances into Mariupol, which is, you know, it's a key area. It's one that has been under siege for quite a while now. People are really suffering in terms of, you know, humanitarian situation, no heat, no food, no water, no electricity. They haven't been able to establish humanitarian corridors. And so Russia basically gave Ukraine this not very good faith offer of, hey, we're going to allow 2 safe corridors out of Mariupol, but you have to surrender. Ukraine, of course, rejected that offer, so fighting does continue there. And again, you know, you've got hundreds of thousands of people there, and it is an absolutely horrific situation on the ground. So the big danger is that, yes, Russia has been frustrated in some of their efforts. They certainly haven't advanced in the time frame that they expected. Their initial forces on the ground are sort of, you know, running out of supplies, and it wasn't really tactically, strategically sound plan to start with. But the question is, all right, how are they going to escalate? What are they going to pull out of their arsenal to go ahead and advance their claims, which will probably be more brutal for civilians?
Excellent. Yeah, and that's part of the thing we tried to emphasize yesterday. It's not that it isn't true in a colloquial sense that the Russians have been stymied and have been kind of basically caught in their inability to move forward with currently what they have. But that isn't necessarily a good thing. And when we consider what it means to win, both sides now are in a belief that they are winning, at least in some form. With the Russians, they just have the capability to bring immense amount more power to bear. At the same time, they're not in a total war economy just yet. They still have to balance their domestic population. They have people like Igor Kotkin, who we'll be speaking to later in the show. So they also have domestic constraints, and they are the invading army, which means that they're generally at a disadvantage, supply lines, all of that. But they still have a tremendous amount of military power, and especially in terms of what we see, if this turns into a total war type of attrition, then it's certainly the benefit is on their side. So let's all just hope that there is some sense in the Kremlin sometime soon in order to bring about peace or to fold, although that is generally pretty unlikely.
Yeah.
Which is just unfortunate because it just means hundreds and thousands of people are at risk. I mean, it really is not an exaggeration. The Russians underwent an immensely brutal campaign twice under Vladimir Putin in Syria and in Chechnya. We just didn't pay a lot of attention to it here in the West. But hundreds of thousands, the most brutal phase of the Syrian civil war was the end. Same too in Chechnya. And that's when the Russians were using cluster munitions on the city of Aleppo and elsewhere. And I currently just do not see a way out of that. Although I do hope that maybe the Ukrainians can fight them to a different type of stalemate and inflict so much pain that they feel the need to negotiate. There was that number that came out yesterday. We were looking with some great interest. There was a leaked report, supposedly leaked. I want to debunk this just in case anybody's seen it. Yeah. Where they said that 10,000 Russian soldiers had died. We were like, oh my God.
This is in a state media outlet in Russia.
But then the state media came out and said, oh, actually we were hacked. So look, we don't know what the actual number is. U.S. intelligence says something like 7,500. Who knows if that is true though? Remember this, in the, I think 11 years of fighting of Soviets in Afghanistan, they only lost 15,000 people. That's their numbers. So if it is 7,000, they've already exceeded the entire U.S. war in Iraq in number of casualties and are now going to territory where they haven't lost that many soldiers in combat in a long, long time.
Yeah, well, in Afghanistan, I mean, Afghanistan was not nearly as precious to the Soviet Union as Ukraine is to Russia. But what you had was at the same time that there was sort of an opening and allowing of the airing of grievances in society in the Soviet Union, it was the mothers of those soldiers who really became sort of the backbone of the movement to end that war. And so, yes, Putin is an autocrat and, does what he wants, more or less. Within Russia, certainly the population did not vote for or encourage this war. Many people were shocked at the actual invasion once it happened. But he still faces domestic political pressure and his own considerations, and is certainly a student of history and understands where those pressure points ultimately lie. You can only conceal, especially in the modern age, death and casualties and injuries for so long, and the extent of the losses that are being suffered by the Russian side. You can only conceal the true nature of this war for so long. And so while he has a lot more in reserve in terms of his military capacity, bringing more forces to bear also carries a risk in terms of your population really beginning to, on a large scale resist. We've obviously brought you the protests that have happened in cities across Russia already, people who are very courageously taking to the street and anti-war and calling for an end to this aggression. But I think it would be fanciful to imagine that that's even a majority of the Russian population at this point, just because the propaganda web that he's weaved is so thick. So anyway, those are some of his domestic political considerations. Do I think we're anywhere close to that? No, I don't. And that's why this is such a devastating and dire situation, because you just can't really see right now how I don't think the Russians are negotiating in good faith. I think they've been holding these peace talks as a way of sort of signaling that they're serious and trying to keep more sanctions from being levied on them and those sorts of things. And the Ukrainians really believe that they're in a position to actually win and not have to concede anything at the negotiating table. And I just don't think that that is a realistic scenario. So that's where we stand right now.
Hey guys, we're gonna be totally upfront with you. This is the most perilous time that we have ever operated in.
It is so difficult just to try to sort through the news, but even more importantly, to bring you accurate information as this wave of lockdown and censorship spreads across the nation.
Yeah, look, if you can become a premium subscriber today at breakingpoints.com, you're gonna help us build out a vibrant, independent media ecosystem which is free of mainstream pressure. We can't tell you how important that is at a time like this.
Yep, that's right. Go to breakingpoints.com to subscribe. We love you guys and we appreciate you so much.